Another option is to mount the battery way forward at the servo mount next to the servo and move the ESC and the receiver to either side of the sliders. Welcome back to Big Song Hobbies. Today I'm going to spend some time talking about the lowering the center of gravity further on my Element Ecto by looking into the battery tray options. But before I jump into today's topic, I want to spend some time talking about battery. Like most of us, when I started this hobby, I jumped into the biggest battery pack from my truck and I picked up a 5200 milliamp LiPo battery. My goal was runtime. However, over time, I learned that like in every decision in our lives, there are pros and cons. Furthermore, I started to get more serious into crawling than trailing and learned over time that certain things work better for me. In most cases, the battery sits higher than the lowest point of the chassis, thus adding quite a bit of weight higher up, increasing the center of gravity. Today, I like to run a smaller 1300 milliamp 3S LiPo battery with higher C rating for my trucks. I find that I can still get easily 1.5 hours to 2 hours per pack. In most cases, I just pack an extra battery or two and that works well out for me. I like the form factor and the overall weight of the 1300 milliamp battery. It minimizes unnecessary weight that can hurt performance. On Element Ecto and the rest of the Element RC Enduro line, they place the battery tray at the front part of the chassis in between the servo and the transmission, which improves the weight distribution by increasing the forward weight bias. One of the reasons why Element Ecto performs so well out of the box. But if you carefully look at the battery tray, the design can be improved to move one of the heavier components of the truck, the battery, down by a few millimeters to help lower the center of gravity. Few millimeters by itself might not seem much, but when you add up all the changes will have a huge impact to your overall performance. So what are the options out there? One of the better options is a 3D printed Element Enduro lower battery tray by Humboldt EF. The size of the battery tray is identical to the dimension of the Shorty battery tray by Element, but the design allows it to sit flush with the chassis. You achieve this by flipping the battery tray mount upside down, which will allow the battery tray to be lowered. And he has added cutout on the battery tray so that it sits flush with the chassis. The other option is to completely remove the battery tray and the battery tray mount and mount the battery onto the sliders via Velcro. I use this method on my LCG chiller rig, as you can see here. The benefit is that the battery is mounted at the lowest point of the chassis and it removes the weight of battery tray and battery tray mount, which helps with lowering the CG. The downside is that you lose the forward weight bias as the battery now sits in the midsection of the chassis. I actually tested this out extensively on my LCG rig and eventually I opted for mounting the battery as you can see here. The lower CG outweighs the benefit of forward weight bias. Another option is to mount the battery way forward at the servo mount next to the servo and move the ESC and the receiver to either side of the sliders or even battery mount. One thing you will need is to be using a smaller battery to make this work optimally. The 1300 milliamp LiPo battery fits there, but I would recommend using even smaller battery in this situation, either 650 milliamp or 850 milliamp batteries. You need to keep that in mind. Mounting the battery at this location helps with the front weight bias, but it also adds weight at the highest point of the chassis. I've been weighing the pros and the cons of the previously mentioned options and decided to go with the LCG battery tray. Instead of using the 3D printed version, I decided to use a Bauhaus RC's and to our low CG battery tray for Element Enduro. It mounts the battery down and forward by 5mm to lower the center of gravity and increase the forward weight bias. Additionally, the servo and the accessory wires and the battery strap can be routed through the slot underneath for very clean look. And the 3D printed option weighs 40 grams. The Bauhaus LCG battery tray weighs 8 grams only. As for the install, it is fairly straightforward. You remove the 4 screws that is holding the battery tray to the battery tray mount, then remove the 4 screws holding the battery tray mount to the chassis. And then you will need to remove the screws holding the front bumper, the servo mount, on one side of the chassis, preferably the right side, as you won't have to worry about the panhard mount. This will allow you to pull the chassis apart enough to pull out the battery tray mount. And then reinstall is just a reverse process. Install the LCG battery tray, install the screws to the battery tray, servo mount, and front bumper. Note the 2 different size screws. The upper one is the short one, the bottom one is the longer one. Here's the LCG battery tray that has been installed. The tray sits flush to the chassis. And here it is with the battery mounted. I hope that you found today's mod informative and useful. Please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified of future videos. Thanks for watching Big Some Hobbies.